This session is the first of two kind of similar sessions that's really highlighting excellence in our work to basically reduce, prevent, prepare for, and respond to spills in the transboundary environment. And this particular session is a real drill down under authorities and legislation. We have four amazing presenters for this session. I'm going to kind of introduce you one by one. And as I do that, I'm going to invite the presenters to kind of come up on the screen so people can kind of connect names and faces. And then we'll kind of go through the presentations one by one. So our first presenter is Assistant Deputy Minister Jessica Wood with the British Columbia Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. Welcome, Jessica. It's great to have you here today. Jessica is going to be providing an overview of BC's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So that's Jessica Wood. Our second presenter is Jamie Bever, who is the Executive Director of the Washington State Board of Pilotage Commission. So let's see, is Jamie on the screen? I need to change my view here. There we go. Hello, Jamie, welcome. Welcome to the forum. And Jamie's going to be talking about the work of the Pilotage Commission to help advance certain aspects of Washington's Safety of Oil Transportation Act, and several specific things around that, including pilotage, tug escorts in Rosario Strait, and a study that's being done, a modeling study on geographic zones. Hopefully I got that all right. Okay, that's Jamie Bever. Our next speaker is JD Leahy from the Washington State Department of Ecology. Welcome, JD. Hello. JD is a maritime risk modeling specialist, and he'll be drilling down much more deeply into that model that I just referred to establish geographic zones. I'll let him take it from there. Okay, and our fourth and final speaker for this session is Senator Joe Williams with the Swinomish Indian tribal community. And I'm gonna wait till Senator Williams comes on the screen. I am not seeing him.
We're getting him on just a second, Hilary.
Excellent, okay. As Caleb is bringing Senator Williams onto the screen, I will share that Senator Williams will be speaking about his work as well as the work. Hello, Senator Williams, how are you?
I'm doing great. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties here.
Oh, you're totally fine. This is such a strange world we're all working in. We're delighted to have you. And I was just sharing with everybody that you'll be sharing some insights about the work that you and the Swinomish Indian tribal community are doing related to what JD and Jamie are working on with advancing the Safety of Oil Transportation Act, but also speaking specifically of the impacts of vessel traffic on treaty rights. Correct? Okay, that's our panel. So without further ado, I'm going to invite everybody except for Jessica Wood to turn off your video and audio. And Jessica, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to you. I'm going to pull up your presentation and I'll be running your presentation. You have 15 minutes. And again, I'll be doing the 3 and the 1 thing. So, and then when you see my face on the screen at the end, that's just a little cue to be done. Okay, so let me get my screen up and running here. Patient, let's see here. Hopefully I can do this seamlessly. Here. And there we go. Okay.
Namaste. Sisit yok stiwayu simkiget smogit sigam hanak. Hello, my name is Jessica Wood. My Smalgak name is Sisit Yokes. I come from the Tsimshian and Gitxsan First Nations with deep roots with the Tahltan and the Nisga'a. I'm honored to join you today from the territory of the Chemainus, Wasonic, and Cowichan First Nations. I'm on Salt Spring Island in BC, and I'm honored to speak with you today. I feel a little fish out of water, if that's not a bad analogy, for this particular forum, given that the work that I'm going to talk to you about has to do with the humanity and the rights of Indigenous peoples and how we affirm that through law here within our province, and the work around building that together with Indigenous peoples. So I'm not a scientist. I do live in the Southern Gulf Islands and am honored to be surrounded by the Salish Sea. But I'm going to speak to you a little bit different than what looks like the rest of your agenda. And so I feel very privileged to be here and share this space with you. I want to honor the nations who have joined us today, the dignitaries, our elders and people of rank. I think it's an important day, and I'm glad to be here with you. I will start off with a little bit of a background on the UN Declaration itself, which was adopted in 2007 after almost 25 years of deliberations by UN members and Indigenous people specifically. There was many people, many Indigenous leaders here in BC who spent a number of decades working on that document. And it articulates the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous people around the world. And this was so significant because the Universal Declaration on Human Rights didn't actually reference Indigenous people. Of course, here in Canada, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in response to the largest class action suit in Canadian history that was advanced by survivors of Indian residential schools here in Canada. So the TRC has called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in their calls to action, calls on all governments to fully adopt and implement the UN Declaration as the framework for reconciliation. Of course, that's been part of customary international law for quite some time and has been fully adopted without reservation here in Canada. What I'll say is, next slide, please. BC's commitments were specific. They started in 2017, specifically to this work around a government that came into place and put into every single minister's mandate letter to implement the UN Declaration, the TRC calls to action. Our first step there was to riff a little bit off of what our federal government had done, which was introduce a guide for public servants federally called the draft principle, or the principles, the 10 principles. We took an approach to that where we released a similar document and draft to public servants as a tool for readiness. And we asked for each ministry to come up with an implementation approach. That came out of a specific work plan that we had developed with the First Nations Leadership Council. And I must say that without the First Nations Leadership Council, and I'll describe them a little bit, and their efforts over many, many years and their specific collaboration during this process, we wouldn't have the legislation we do, and it wouldn't be as dynamic and reflective of Indigenous knowledge and wisdom as it is. In 2015, something was signed called the Commitment Document that framed the relationship between the First Nations Leadership Council and the province of BC. The First Nations Leadership Council is a coalition of 3 different Indigenous leadership organizations here in BC, the First Nations Summit, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and the BC Assembly of First Nations. Of all different political organizations, they work very similarly in seeking direction for their responsibilities from Chief and Council, from members. And they've agreed to work together on areas of mutual interest, and they've agreed to work with us on specific areas of mutual interest here with the province. That was affirmed through renewal of a document called the Concrete Actions, which was our joint work plan. So while something like the principles were in there, Goal 1, Action 1 called for legislation to implement the UN Declaration by fall 2019. Now, we had to adjust that timeline a little bit, but we were successful specifically by the end of November, when the Declaration Act received royal assent, having been endorsed after 23 hours of committee debate by all sides of the House. There's some other commitments that have come out of there, including treaty-related commitments. We had a recognition of rights policy. We had the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and this was also affirmed through our throne and budget speeches through 2019 and 2020. What I think you're starting to see here is the necessary but also opportunity that was built because there was a readiness. there is a readiness around reconciliation. There is enough understanding and movement that has been led by Indigenous peoples where there was room created and there was a political will from multiple parties, and I would say including other levels of government and stakeholders. Now, it's important to note that we had actually based our legislation on a private member's bill that had been introduced federally by MP Romeo Saganash that is referred to as C262. So it's a very similar piece of legislation that would be federal legislation. The government of the time had endorsed supporting the private member's bill, and it had gone all the way to the Senate. And at the Senate, the writ was dropped, and so it died on the order papers. So while we had thought we would be a little bit behind the federal government, government made the decision to continue, and we ended up being first in the country. Now, there's not a lot of jurisdictions that have adopted and implemented the declaration through law. There have been different approaches to action plans to support it, but we're the first province definitely to incorporate it specifically into our laws and the obligations that go with it. I'll give you a little bit of background too on how we got here. If we could go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, I described the First Nations Leadership Council, who I probably did not do the description justice. As I said, they're directed through resolution. So definitely it's a different way than our provincial government works. The First Nations Leadership Council has high accountability and transparency with their membership, with their constituents, and they are responsible too. Whereas in our democratic process, we elect leaders, they go into something called cabinet confidence, and we don't see the laws or the efforts that they're doing until they hit the floor of the legislature. So two very different ways of working, high transparency and one that privileges confidence. So we had to come up with a way, though we had those resolutions to work together, we needed to work under NDA. We had to work under a non-disclosure agreement. And the First Nations Leadership Council was able to bring forward legal counsel experts that contributed significantly. And we did things like joint instructions. So what I would say is that process of collaboration is so intrinsic to the success of this bill, but also to how the entire process unfolded. Having Indigenous people participate, Indigenous legal experts, to bring the knowledge of our adak, of our laws, of our sacred laws, into a process that has been I would say that has not been inclusive or reflective of that, was transformative. It was difficult, it was challenging, it was not always guaranteed success, but ultimately it made for a stronger bill. It made for a stronger relationship and a stronger foundation for the work that we'll talk about as well to follow. What I would say is it's probably important to understand what the bill does. And so if we could go to the next slide. And so it establishes the declaration as the framework for reconciliation. It establishes a positive obligation on the province to do things differently. And it's unique in that generally the conventions of good legislation are you don't say things that have already been said elsewhere. We say things like nothing abrogates or derogates from our Constitution, and of course nothing can or should attempt to, but to be clear that any interpretation will be considered in that light. We also have space. We've created space with this legislation, and normally the convention on good legislation is that you are explicit about what it does and does not do. But to reflect on what that would have looked like in this bill would have been something very exclusionary and repetitive of anything that we may have done before. So what this does is give us that legislative, regulatory, and policy obligation to make changes over time in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, given the scope and scale of what something may be of interest or have impact. So we have to ensure that our laws are brought into alignment with the declaration. It says all measures necessary, and those measures are you can introduce new laws or you can amend existing laws. We have to develop and implement an action plan. Now, different from the federal legislation is where we get into a little bit here, is that we have to achieve the objectives of the UN Declaration. And we need to monitor progress through annual reporting. The federal legislation had proposed a time limit on that. We have not put a time limit on this piece of legislation in terms of annual reporting. And it also does two things. It creates space to enter into agreements with Indigenous governing bodies, which recognizes self-determination more broadly and brings us more into an era of empowerment rather than restriction when it comes to that self-determination. And it also includes a provision that allows us to seek a mandate on joint or consent-based decision-making agreements, shared decision-making. We have tools about where we can take input. We have tools about delegated jurisdiction, and we have tools of recognizing jurisdiction, but we don't have those great tools we hadn't until now of how you start to build shared jurisdiction. How do you make decisions together? And I would say that because of the leadership of the First Nations Leadership Council, we were able to get to those tangible and progressive tools that would meet the needs of where our relationship is now and where it needs to go. So what I would say in terms of the overview of the Act, you'll start at the beginning. It's very short, it's a couple of pages with the appendix of the UN Declaration at the end. So you'll start with an interpretation section, and we're clear that we haven't used a definition section. That's a really important distinction because we as the province, it is our law, should not be the one who is defining who Indigenous governing bodies are or who Indigenous peoples are. That is part of self-determination. So section 1 to 5 are really focused on interpreting and implementing the UN Declaration. And as I said, section 6 and 7 are space for government to enter into a broader range of agreements. The last section, the section 8, is the Offence Act. Just ensures that if there is a non-compliance issue, that the minister isn't personally fined, and the Judicial Review Procedures Act allows for joint statutory authority, that there's still a process of judicial review that could apply. So the modest regulation making power at the end is also, should there be something that we need to bring in through regulation, administrative or just procedural matters, that we have the ability to do so and that we've made space for there to be regulations added in the future. Next slide, please. The alignment of laws.
Jess,
yes?
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but for some reason I'm not able to put my video on. So this is a verbal cue that you have about a minute left, okay?
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. So we have the alignment of law section, which I think I've covered. If we go to the next slide, the action plan is where we are now. We are, of course, in interregnum period, so I can't speak of what is yet to come. But there is a plan to move forward with an action plan and, of course, an annual report. I'll leave you with, if we can actually just pop to the last slide, there's a couple of resources there. Oh, sorry, second to last slide. I'll leave you with our government website, where the Declaration Act actually lives, and the 23 hours of committee debate. And again, my sincere gratitude to the Union BC Indian Chiefs, the First Nations Summit, and the BC AFN for their tireless commitment to this work over decades, and for supporting the province of BC to come to this place where we could actually bring in a really dynamic and respectful bill that does some pretty sophisticated things in a very short document. So appreciate your time, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Hold on, I'm dealing with video challenges. Okay, thank you so much, Jessica, and I realize I should probably be calling you Assistant Deputy Minister Wood, and I apologize for that, but thank you for forgiving me. I've loved your presentation, really appreciate that. And I'm going to invite Sarah Brace, who's my co-moderator, to pop in and see if there are any questions for you. We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, at present there are none, but if people have a question and want to type it into the Q&A, maybe we have time for 1 question, but at present I don't see any.
Great, okay, thank you. And I understand that you have to leave us now, so you won't be here. Okay, so if you have a question for Assistant Deputy Minister Wood, please, this is your time to ask her. Anything, Sarah, nothing?
No,
okay.
not at the moment.
Nothing. Okay. Well,
nope.
Thank you very much for your time. We really greatly appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Okay. Now we are going to pivot to our next presentation, and Caleb, I am going to ask you if you could please not override my video, because I need to be able to pop on and give people a time cue. Thank you.
Yep, it shouldn't have been overridden there. That was odd.
Okay, it
yeah.
was, but yeah, maybe that's a little technical glitch. Okay, our next presenter is Jamie Bever, the Executive Director with the Washington Pilotage Commission. So Jamie, I'm going to invite you to come on up, audio, video. Hello again. And again, Jamie's going to be focusing in on work that the Pilotage Commission has been doing to advance Washington's Safety of Oil Transportation Act. So with that, Jamie, I'm going to go off audio and video, and I'm going to get to your presentation going. So it's just going to take me a second.
All right. Okay, I think we're up and running. Thanks, Hilary. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 4A. My name is Jamie Bever, and I'm the Executive Director of the Washington State Board of Pilotage Commissioners. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am presenting today from the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about our agency, about marine pilots, then talk about the legislation that brought us here, the timeline of the Board of Pilotage Commissioners' deliverables, the work of the board's Oil Transportation Safety Committee, the board adopted interpretive statement, monitoring and enforcement of the new law, and the next steps per the directive of and gross substitute House Bill 1578. So the Board of Pilotage Commissioners, or BPC as I'll be referring to us, was created in 1935 by the Washington State Legislature. Our primary mission is to ensure against the loss of lives, the loss of or damage to property and vessels, and to protect the marine environment by maintaining efficient and competent pilotage service on our state's inland waters. Our statutory authority is the Pilotage Act, Chapter 8816 RCW. We are a 9-member board plus 3 staff, and our primary responsibilities are training, licensing, and regulating Washington State's pilots. Here's a little information about pilots. They are high-level maritime professionals who have completed highly specialized training to obtain local knowledge expertise for a particular region. They are the first line of safety on our waters. Here in Washington, state licensed pilots are required on all oil tankers and foreign flagged vessels. Governor Inslee declared pilots as essential workers in his emergency orders regarding COVID-19. The pilots continue to move vessels in and out of the area using an abundance of caution, best practices protocol for protection, and under the guidance of a physician. Next slide, please. Here are Washington's 2 pilotage districts. The Puget Sound Pilotage District is one of, if not the largest, pilotage district in the country. The little black dot is the LA Long Beach District for comparison. It is serviced by Puget Sound pilots, who are an association of independent contractors. There are currently 56 authorized pilot licenses in Puget Sound. And then further south in our state, we have the Grays Harbor Pilotage District, which is operated by the Port of Grays Harbor, where pilots are employees of the port. And there are currently 3 authorized pilot licenses in Grays Harbor. Next slide, please. The 2019 Washington State Legislature passed the Reducing Threats to Southern Resident Killer Whales by Improving the Safety of Oil Transportation Act via Engrossed Substitute House Bill 1578. The legislation laid out a multi-year process for data collection, analyzation, and ultimately establishment of rules regarding tug escorts on laden tankers, articulated tug barges, and waterborne tank vessels between 5,000 and 40,000 deadweight tons in Puget Sound. The first step of this process was statutory implementation of tug escorts in Rosario Strait and connected waterways east, which were effective September 1st, 2020. Next slide, please. So here's a brief timeline of the deliverables assigned to the BPC. September 1st, 2020 was the Rosario Strait and Connected Waterways East tug escort implementation and also identification of geographic zones to inform ecology's risk model, which you will hear more about from JD at the next session or the next presentation. December 31st, 2021, a synopsis of changing vessel traffic trends presented to the legislature. BPC entered into an interagency agreement with Ecology for technical support and has adopted a scope of work for the synopsis, which will ultimately be prepared by Ecology and considered and approved by the BPC prior to delivery to the legislature. September 1st, 2023, consultation with tribes, local and federal government and stakeholders, and conduct analysis of Ecology's risk model. December 31st, 2025, adopt rules for tug escorts in Puget Sound. This work will be done with direct collaboration with Ecology and developed through consultation and the analysis of the risk model at the BPC level. And then October 1st, 2028, review the rules every 10 years thereafter and make any necessary adjustments. Next slide, please. The BPC created the Oil Transportation Safety Committee, or OTSC, by adopting a charter and committee membership. The first meeting of the OTSC took place in February of 2020. The purpose of the committee was to conduct analysis and provide recommendations for the board concerning the responsibilities outlined in ESHB 1578, using a phased approach to move through each directive. Detailed minutes of the OTSC meetings can be found on our website. The first phase of OTSC work was the tug escort implementation in Rosario Strait and connected waterways east and the geographic zone identification. Next slide, please. The OTSC is made up of state agencies, tribes, stakeholders, including the oil and tug industry, the environmental community, and pilots, with the United States Coast Guard in an advisory role, bringing together varying perspectives to craft thoughtful recommendations for board consideration. Here are the committee positions and their representatives. As you can see, there are several alternates for each position, which we found useful for providing subject matter expertise and to fill in for members who were unable to attend meetings. Next slide, please. The first phase of the OTSC work was the September 1st, 2020 deliverables, tug escort implementation in Rosario Strait and connected waterways east, and the geographic zone identification. The OTSC met 6 times from February to June to complete this first phase of work. The results of those meetings were 2 board-approved documents, the interpretive statement and the geographic zones. I would like to acknowledge that the OTSC did an incredible amount of work in 4 months to come to a majority consensus on the final recommendations. Next slide, please. The interpretive statement was the primary tool for tug escort implementation. The committee identified terms in ESHB 1578 based on their individual expertise and feedback from their constituents that needed clarity for when the law went into effect. The OTSC developed definitions and recommendations for those terms for the BPC to consider and adopt. The definitions were developed using a practical on-the-water perspective, which proved to be a good middle ground for eventually reaching majority consensus on the definitions by the committee. For consistency, justification, and efficiency, the OTSE sought and relied on many already published definitions to inform, adapt, or adopt for this interpretation regarding the tug escort implementation directives. The sources include, but are not limited to, federal regulations, the Puget Sound Harbor Safety Plan, the Washington Administrative Code, and the Revised Code of Washington. And the interpretive statement was adopted by the board at the June meeting. The OTSE will meet again next week to review questions and concerns that have come up since the September 1st tug escort implementation, and to make any necessary clarifications to the interpretive statement. We're also going to be looking at FAQs. Next slide, please. So regarding monitoring and enforcement, as we have done historically, we will be relying on the eyes and ears of our maritime partners on or in view of the water to inform us of potential violations to the law. If we become aware of a potential violation, the BPC will contact operators and, if needed, investigate any noncompliance. The board recently adopted a tank vessel movement report to be filled out by operators and submitted to the BPC for tracking. We have been receiving some reports, and I want to give a big shout out to Centerline Logistics and Vane Brothers, who have been really great in returning those forms. So thank you. While the form is currently not required, we will be monitoring its use and may explore ways to implement mandatory submission. In addition, the BPC can take legal action pursuant to 8816-150 RCW, which states that violators of the provisions of the Pilotage Act are liable to a maximum civil penalty of up to $10,000 per violation. And finally, legislation could be introduced if enforcement authority becomes necessary. Next slide, please. To prepare the public for the September 1st implementation, the BPC held listening sessions in 2019, 2 webinars with Q&A sessions, and also presented at the Harbor Safety Committee meeting in July and August of 2020. We also sent an open letter to operators prior to implementation. We are happy to see and hear that as of September 1st, industry was complying with the new tug escort laws. Next slide, please. The next step in the process of implementing 1578 are the directives, other 1578 directives, is the synopsis of changing vessel traffic trends. As I mentioned before, the board has approved the scope of work with the Department of Ecology for the synopsis. The OTSE and the BPC will receive updates on this process as it unfolds. And here is a quick timeline of the synopsis development process. So September 1st, 2019 was the start of pre-tug escort implementation data collection, and that concluded on August 31st, 2020. And then September 1st, 2020 was the start of post-tug escort implementation data collection, and that concludes on August 31st, 2021. By November 4th, Ecology will deliver a draft synopsis to the BPC for review. And December 2nd, the BPC will, by December 2nd, Ecology will deliver the final draft to the BPC for consideration and adoption. And then by December 31st, 2021, the BPC will publish the synopsis and submit it to the legislature. Next slide, please, which is my conclusion slide. So I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Really appreciate that great presentation. And I'm going to kind of pivot over to my co-moderator, Sarah Brace, who's been looking at the Q&A to see if there are questions for you.
You betcha. We've got a question for you. The question is pilotage required for 18,000 TEU container ships as well, given that they have fuel capacities greater than some of the ATBs that transport oil as cargo in the Sailor Sea? And this is thinking ahead to future changes as a result of terminal expansion projects that would allow for these 18,000 TEU vessels.
So the question is whether or not it's a foreign flagged vessel. And I believe that most 18,000 TEU vessels that would come to our area would be foreign flagged, and therefore a Washington state licensed pilot would be required on that vessel. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only question we have so far. I'm checking. Oh, we have one more that just came in. Are changes in vessel traffic as a result of the rule being documented? are there vessels that have been transiting Rosario that are now transiting boundary past Rosario Strait?
So that is the whole reason why we're doing a synopsis of changing vessel traffic trends. And so data is being gathered for the year prior to implementation and after post-implementation so that we can actually see the differences. And that is the work that Ecology is doing right now. And we will be finishing and submitting at the end of 2021. So
Excellent.
It's in process.
Okay, we have one more. I will keep going as they come in until Hilary gives me the timeout. So there's one more here. Also thinking ahead here, how have penalty costs been determined? Provided the various risks to natural resources, are there considerations to variable risk to penalty scale?
I would say, not that I know of for our agency in particular, depending, I've only been with the agency for 5 years or so, and I am not aware of any use of that particular RCW regarding civil penalties to draw back to, but that doesn't mean there isn't something further back in the history of the agency. But all of those things will be taken into consideration as we move forward. Especially as we lean into the tug escort requirements for the entire Puget Sound.
Great, thank you. Hilary, one more? Okay, yeah, great, one more.
Great, thank you.
What efforts are being made to work with Canada on traffic analysis and risk assessment?
So that work, for Rosario Strait in particular, since it's in US waters, we've been focusing just on the US side, but when we start looking at the broader Puget Sound and transboundary issues, there will definitely be some collaboration with our partners across the way.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you, Jamie, for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for bringing up the Q&A. And I believe that there are maybe a few more questions for you, Jamie. So if you are willing to kind of go into the Q&A feature in Zoom and maybe kind of directly address them, that would be great.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. Really appreciate it. So now we're going to pivot to our next presenter, which is JD Leahy from the Washington State Department of Ecology. And as I mentioned earlier, JD is going to drill a little bit deeper into this topic of modeling for the geographic zones. So with that, JD, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to you. I think I'm going to do a quicker job of getting the screen share with your presentation than I did for Jamie. So here we go.
All right, so thanks, Hilary, for that introduction. As Hilary said, my name's JD Ross Leahy, and I'm one of the members of the Ecology Spills Program Model Development Team. I'll be presenting today, but this presentation is a joint creation of the whole modeling team that you see listed here. I'd also like to take a moment just before we get started to acknowledge that, like Jamie, I'm also speaking to you from the traditional land of the Duwamish people, past and present. And I'm grateful to be speaking to everyone today, and it really is an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. Next slide. So I want to start today with some background on our model development project, how this project came to be and our goals for it. And from there, I want to outline our approach to building our model, how we've broken out the project into modules, to help clarify the different pieces of the model that we need to build, and our roadmap for feedback and engagement opportunities. And then at the end, I'll just wrap up with an update on where we stand currently in model development, our upcoming next steps, and ways to learn more and get involved if folks are so inclined. Next slide. So the model development project that I'm presenting on today is part of a group of measures that were passed by the Washington State Legislature in 2019, designed to reduce the risk of oil spills and protect our southern resident killer whales. So specifically, the bill requires Ecology to build an oil spill risk model. And the model needs to be able to, quote, quantitatively assess current and potential future risks of oil spills from covered vessels in Washington waters. And to accomplish this, the legislature provided funding for ecology to hire our modeling team. Next slide. So as a modeling team, we're treating each step of model development as a research effort, and we're committed to a transparent approach that provides an open and inclusive feedback loop with tribes and stakeholders. And we're also committed to using sound methodology and documenting our work. And we also believe that model validation will be an important step in this process, and that we really will look to benefit from peer review. And this research philosophy really shapes how we approach every one of the project tasks that we're faced with. Next slide, please. So the objective of the model development project is to create a tool that can be used to assess current and potential future oil spill risk. And this tool must be able to complete the 2 future analyses that we've been assigned to by the legislature, but we're also assuring that we're designing a model that will provide a generalized framework for evaluating oil spill risk, and that through this work, we're developing the capacity to conduct research and provide insight into high priority oil spill risk questions. Next slide. So as part of this, we're building what we're calling a foundational model that's made up of a series of modules. And we're using this word foundational to emphasize that we're building a model that can meet our near-term requirements, but also one that's organized broadly enough that it can be expanded to meet additional needs. Next slide, or just next, yeah, thank you. Each module will deal with an element of determining oil spill risk. And these elements include modeling vessel movements with the vessel movement module, then using the outputs to feed a vessel encounter module that measures and evaluates relationships between each vessel and the shore and other vessels. And then the accident module will evaluate situations for their potential to lead to accidents. And the oil outflow module will estimate spills from simulated accidents. Next slide. So any type of risk analysis effort depends on open and robust communication. And this project and our model is no exception to that. And so through outreach, we hope to build a shared understanding of the mathematical backbone of the model. And we want anyone who's interested to have the opportunity to become intimately familiar with how the model works. And we also want to provide an open door for local knowledge and expertise. As we establish the various components of the model, we'll need feedback to assure that the model is successfully reflecting the waterway. And our outreach efforts also acknowledge the transboundary aspect of the waterway and of the model that we're creating. And we're excited to have interest and participation of stakeholders and First Nations from north of the border. So after our first 4 introductory webinars, which have already taken place, where we introduced the project and outlined our modeling approach, we had our first module-specific webinar last month. We plan to have 2 of these webinars per module over the next 10 months. And during these events, we'll individually discuss each module and get feedback and suggestions on how best to solve the challenges that we're facing. Next slide. So some components of each of the modules will also benefit from supplemental opportunities for feedback. And for these components, we have some additional ideas to support engagement, including written summaries and focused technical discussion sessions, which you can see described here on the slide. All of our events are open to anyone who's interested, and you can find recordings of previous events and also instructions on how to register for upcoming events on our webpage or by sending me an email. And all of that information, my contact information and the webpage will be up on the last slide today. Next slide. I want to transition now to talk about where we're at currently in model development. As I mentioned, we just had our first module-specific webinar in September, where we dove into the details of our vessel movement module, which is the first of the 4 modules that make up our oil spill risk model. So the purpose of the vessel movement module is to model maritime activity using AIS data. And the goal is to simulate vessel activity and potential changes in traffic volume. And to do this, we need to generate simulated AIS data that will allow us to evaluate the frequency distribution of potential accidents. We can't just use past AIS data because what we can observe in the past data is just one realized configuration of marine traffic. Simulating vessel movements allows us to produce enough data to reach conclusions based on patterns of vessel behavior. Next slide. So in order to do this in its most bare bones form, the vessel movement module needs 4 things. It needs a geographic area with boundaries that define where the model will simulate vessels. It needs AIS message data to build our simulation. And it needs to be able to group those AIS messages into tracks and then aggregate those tracks into routes. Next slide. So first, let's start with the geographic area, which you can see represented on the map in yellow. So the area captures the entirety of the VTS traffic separation scheme. And to the west, the area is bounded by an arc approximately 20 nautical miles past the J buoy, and to the north with a line from Nanoose Bay to Seashell. So our selection of this geographic area recognizes and acknowledges that the traffic movement in the Washington portion of the Salish Sea is linked to the movement on the Canadian side, and that to look at both is an important part of the transboundary aspect of reducing oil spill risk in our shared waters. Next slide. So AIS data comes in discrete sequential messages with a variety of information included in each message. And so we use this to identify the individual tracks that vessels have used. Next slide. One challenge is that while vessels operate on similar pathways, the nature of the marine environment means that their specific path is almost always unique to that time and place. Also, different types of vessels take different paths, and the same vessel may take different paths depending on other factors. So we want to make sure that this variation is represented in our movement module. So we need to evaluate all the different pathways that a vessel takes between a given origin and destination. And we call these pathways tracks. A track is a series of sequential AIS messages with a start and end point, with each start and end point assigned an origin or destination. Next slide. So once we've established the tracks, found their start and end points, and assigned them an origin and destination, then we group them into what we call a route. And a route is a collection of tracks that have the same origin and destination. Next slide. So this slide shows the same tracks as before, but differentiated by vessel type, by color there. Within our vessel movement module, we want to recognize that different tracks within a route may be used for a variety of reasons. And here we show vessel type as a possible factor in track selection within a route. We can see the ATB and the tug in yellow and light green are taking the two-way route for slower vessels, separating them from the tracks taken by the deep draft vessels that are using the primary traffic separation scheme. So if this trend were to hold, that would mean vessel type would be a factor in track selection on voyages from sea to Port Angeles. Next slide. So what we've just gone over, the AIS data and the tracks and routes represents the basic foundation of the vessel movement module. But in order for the vessel movement module to represent something closer to the actual complexity of our waterway, we need to look at some additional pieces. Next slide. So these additional pieces, track selection factors, some external navigation rules like for instance, the turn point special operating area, rules for dependent vessels like pilot boats and tug escorts, and also a strategy for representing vessels that don't transmit an AIS signal. These are all topics that we'll tackle in our upcoming technical discussion sessions. In the interest of time, for today, I'll just give a brief description of the first one, track selection factors. Next slide. So for the vessel movement module to work, we need vessels with appropriate characteristics to be moving on routes that are appropriate for them and to be moving on those routes in an appropriate distribution. There's a number of factors that could influence track selection by vessels in our simulation. We're reasonably confident that vessel type will be a significant factor. An example is the use of the two-way route for slower vessels in the Strait of Juan de Fuca that we just saw. But to get this right, we'll need to create a vessel taxonomy that groups vessels based on the types of tracks they'll take, as the AIS types that we see in just raw AIS data are not specific enough to meet our needs in this case. Next slide. For other factors that might influence track selection, a number of researchers have examined a variety of potentially meaningful factors. And based on experience, we might expect visibility or weather to influence track selection. But it's also possible we find correlations between other factors in track selection, like tides, presence of a tug escort, day of the week, or other things. So we'll look for feedback on our breakdown of vessel types, as well as additional ideas on which factors we should investigate as part of this. For all these possible factors, we will use statistical hypothesis testing to test if they do indeed have a significant effect on vessel track selection. Next slide. So track selection factors and the other components of the vessel movement module will each have their day in the sun for us to talk even more about them during our upcoming discussion sessions. The first one is just a week away, and they stretch on into early November. I hope some of what I've touched on today, if you found it interesting or intriguing, and I really hope that you consider attending one of these sessions, one or more of these sessions. We're always looking for feedback from folks that are interested in these topics. Next slide. So we also have our next more formal webinar planned for November 19th. This event will be a follow-up presentation on the vessel movement module, and we'll summarize our progress and decision-making around module components, and we'll talk through what work remains and next steps. Next slide. So thank you everyone so much for your time. Like I said at the beginning, it was an honor to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And so I just want to end with my contact information here, and also the sort of long link to the webpage. But if you prefer, you could just send me a note and I can send you a link to the webpage via email. But please feel free to contact me with feedback or suggestions or help signing up for any of our events. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, JD. What a great presentation and overview of that topic. I'm going to invite Sarah Brace, my co-moderator, to bring up some questions that I've seen have popped up in the Q&A. So Sarah?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, thanks, JD. There was one quick question about clarification on the term vessel encounter module. Wondered if you could define that term.
Yeah. So basically, within the within the context of these risk assessments, a lot of folks use the phrase encounter or to talk about an interaction between two vessels. So there's lots of different ways to describe an interaction. It basically just means two vessels sort of getting near enough to one another that it's somehow meaningful. So that could go all the way from just, within a few miles of one another, so they're at least considering the existence of each other, or to the point of trying to determine if it's actually like a near miss or something where something dangerous happened. We haven't come to any kind of conclusions or determination of what type of encounter module we're going to be looking at. But once we get to that, we know that we need one. And once we get to those presentations, that's when we'll really be digging into that topic and looking for feedback from participants and interested parties, stakeholders, tribes, and First Nations on ways to do that. On ways to do that.
Great. Okay. Here's another one for you. This audience will be especially interested in how the model addresses the consequences of oil spills. Please tell us about that.
Yeah, thanks. So, the way that we're currently looking at consequences as part of the model is basically that a number of data points will be produced by the model, including like the size of potential spill, its location, its day and time, the type of oil that spilled, and details about the accident that precipitated it, stuff like that. So all these factors basically will represent our outputs, which in our framing is essentially our consequence. There are deeper ways to investigate consequence in oil spill risk modeling. And like, for instance, some of the trajectory, like fate and effects models that are out there. And we'll look to have our model basically be producing the information that one could use to do further analysis of consequence. But in the short term, we're just going to be looking at those building blocks of consequence as outputs of our model.
Sarah,
Great.
we have
Thank
time
you.
for one more question.
Okay, here's one. Is there any interest in expanding the model beyond oil spills in the future to consider other types of spills, for example?
Yeah, great question. So, what we're currently tasked with is building a tool that will help inform decision-making around oil spill risk. So, that's our direction from the legislature. It's a huge project. That's where we're focused. That said, the question was, is there interest? There certainly is interest. We get a lot of questions about other things that, the model could maybe look at. And I think all of those things are worth talking about. I really hope that as a tool, this is something that's helpful and builds knowledge, shared understanding, through this process. I think it's interesting to think about other things that it could be used for, but at the moment, just oil spill risk.
Awesome. Great. There is one or two more in the Q&A, so maybe after we wrap up here, you could pop in and respond to those. That would be great. Awesome. Thanks. Thanks, Hilary.
Thanks,
JD.
Sarah. And thank you very much, JD. Really appreciate that great presentation. We are going to now pivot to our fourth and final presentation in this session, and that is with Senator Joe Williams. So Senator Williams, I invite you to come on the screen now as I introduce you again. Senator Williams is with the Swinomish Indian tribal community. He's going to be speaking about the Swinomish tribal community's engagement with both Jamie and JD in the work that they just described, as well as impacts of vessel traffic on treaty rights. So Senator Williams, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. It's going to take me just a sec to get your presentation up and going, so bear with me here.
Dalatu. It's quite Teasda. Good morning. My name is Joseph Williams. My ancestral name is First of all, I'd like to say thanks the Share Waters Forum, for allowing Swinomish to share our story, and say thanks to the previous presenters for their wonderful presentations. As noted, I'm the vice chairman of the Swinomish tribe, and also a member of the Fish and Game Commission here at Swinomish, and above all, I'm a lifelong Swinomish fisherman. The Swinomish tribe is a present-day successor of the Swinomish people, the Samish people, Lower Skagit and Kikialis also, and they're signers of the Treaty of 1855, Point Elliott, with the United States. And as my ancestor Squaquai did in 1855, he signed for the Lower Skagit people, and by doing so, relocated his people to the Swinomish Reservation and guaranteed the treaty rights to fish in their usual and accustomed areas, known as their UNA, as adjudicated in 1975 in the case of the United States versus Washington, also known as the Bolt decision. The Swinomish tribe has the second largest fishing fleet in the Salish Sea and is one of only 5 tribes with a unique perspective of UNA from the Port Angeles area east and north to the Canadian border. These tribes include Swinomish, Lummi, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Nooksack, and we're all part of the Coast Salish Nation that extends well up into the Canadian side of the Salish Sea. For thousands of years, our homeland contained no international borders, and what is designated now as the Canadian portion of the Salish Sea to us remains part of the Coast Salish homeland. I personally have fished these waters my entire life, starting with my first job at the age of 7 for one of my uncles. I fished for him for 6 years, and moving on to other boats, and presently operate my own vessel. I raised my children on the Salish Sea, all 4 of them. My oldest boys now started with me when they were 6 years old and are operating their own vessels now. We fish for salmon using drift gill nets, for halibut and crab, shrimp. I also dive for sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and geoduck, as well as harvesting clams. Like all Coast Salish families, we fish for commercial and subsistence and cultural uses. Of all of the Coast Salish U.S. treaty fishing tribes, Swinomish and Lummi have a unique perspective that is directly relevant to the work of preventing oil spills and damage to the environment from oil and fuel transport. From 3 important vantage points. First, we have the 2 largest fishing fleets in the Salish Sea. Second, the March Point and Cherry Point refineries were located in the 50s, directly adjacent to our Indian reservations. The continual transport of oil tankers, ATBs, tugs, in and out of our area are a steady and intense fact of life and in operation of our commercial subsistence and cultural fishing. Our children, as I expressed, they're fishing with us on our vessels, and we fear for them today and in the future. Third, marine routes past our reservations carry the most oil of anywhere in the Salish Sea, calculating the most time that oil spends on the water per volume. And our next slide shows that comparison. Thank you. The Swinomish has a fourth and fifth unique point of perspective. Swinomish fishermen now encounter a steady stream of all types of vessels as legislation mandates new routing into Rosario Strait beginning this past September 1st. Swinomish fishermen coming out of the Swinomish Channel and the Guimas Channel confront added intensity of the anchorage usage at Vendovi and Jack Island, including cargo and tanker ships in and out of their tug escorts and refueling vessels of service. Our next slide showing 1 year's worth of vessel traffic of all types within this area to give you an idea of what we face. And if you notice the high volume of traffic in that area, our first fall crab fishery had just taken place around October 1st, and my children were fishing this area, my two oldest boys. And as I stated, I fear for them in their small vessel pulling crab gear near all of this traffic. But they reported to me that they lost 2 crab pots near Vendovi due to vessel traffic. And, you know, we're just a small portion of that fleet. Swinomish has 100 crab fishermen. I believe Lummi has 200 crab fishermen that fish, you know, in this area. So these are very huge concerns for all of us. At Swinomish, in addition to the proliferation of cross-border traffic, we're concentrating on the challenges we face, in particular at Rosario and Vendovi. And our third slide here, we cannot rest, as shown here by Ecology from their 2018 cumulative impact study of Vendovi anchorages. This is an ongoing study that shows the anchorage area is only vacant 13% of the year. And we fish actively for salmon and crab in this area with our children on board. It's for these reasons I joined the Pilotages Board Oil Transportation Safety Committee. And I want to share a few thoughts on cumulative impacts on treaty fishermen. Swinomish has been active in transboundary conversations for the past 8 years, calling attention to the effect that increased tankers, cargo ships, and surface vessels have on the exercise of our treaty rights. These rights fall within the umbrella of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In that discussion with agencies and marine industries, Coast Salish tribes and First Nations have clearly pointed out the blind spot in the project-by-project review that is the bread and butter of our Canadian and US federal, state, and provincial agencies. When the perspective is changed to look at the collective effect of multiple projects, it is possible to know the number of small oil spills and the frequency of interference with treaty fishing sets and gear loss, and the increased level of oil and fuel spill risk as a whole picture. Fortunately, the call over the years for a baseline study of cumulative impacts has reached our state legislature. As a result, Ecology is now conducting a baseline study of all 2018 ship traffic, and based in part on Canadian ratification of Indigenous rights covenants. Canada's Ocean Protection Plan is conducting its review of South British Columbia cumulative ship traffic. Swinomish is interested in seeing how its data may fit into those studies, as are other tribes and First Nations. While we're gratified that attention is being paid to cross-border cumulative impacts, there is more to be done and Swinomish, its brothers and sister tribes and First Nations will continue on that path in partnership with agencies and marine industries and NGOs. Just a couple of suggestions on a path moving forward. First, each of the ongoing vessel traffic studies at Ecology and in Canada should input data on U.S. treaty fishing available from fish tickets and other data from Fish and Wildlife, utilizing the methodology outlined in Glostein's report conducted for the Gateway Pacific Terminal. Second, a detailed study of annual levels of anchorage usage at Vendovie, Bellingham Bay, Anacortes, and Port Townsend should be conducted in partnership between the tribes, the marine industry, the Coast Guard, the Department of Ecology, and Natural Resources, including estimates of how often they're used to store fossil fuels awaiting a berth. Third, Washington State and British Columbia should conduct a review with the participation of stakeholders and tribes of all existing protocols between their states and federal governments for the sharing of information and proposals and their environmental impacts. And last, the U.S. Coast Guard and Canadian Coast Guard should conduct similar reviews of protocols that can ensure that VTS authorities apply a uniform set of laws and regulations on both sides of Haro Strait and the Strait of Juan de Fuca for the protection of the southern resident killer whale and indigenous and treaty fishing. Swinomish would also like to see Washington State embark upon the same path that British Columbia successfully navigated to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples until such time as the US Senate ratifies that convention and the law of the sea. Our elders have taught us that it's our job as tribal leaders to look forward to the next 7 generations to protect our Salish Sea, that we do not own the Salish Sea or the lands that we live on. We're mere stewards, and it's our job to protect it for the next generations and to speak for our relatives that live in the Salish Sea and on land that do not have voices, like the southern resident killer whale. Our children are on the water, and there's no time to lose. The treaty fishing rights of those children, their children, and their grandchildren are at stake. It's their right. So I want to thank you for your attention. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Senator Williams, for that wonderful presentation. I am going to invite Sarah Brace back. I'm also going to invite JD and Jamie back because we have 5 minutes. Sarah, I'm not seeing any specific questions to Senator Williams in the Q&A. Am I right about that?
We do have one that just came in. Yep.
Great. Okay.
And I'll go ahead and read it. Yeah.
Great.
Joe, what are your thoughts on the inclusion of tribal vessels or fishing permits in the Salish Sea into the data in order to provide a significant vessel safety assessment? Into the data, yeah. It's
okay. There we go. I, as expressed in the presentation, I feel it's very important, that we, as tribes, are definitely inputted into that equation. I think we encounter more vessel traffic on a daily basis than probably anyone else in the Salish Sea. On any given day, I could run by a dozen tankers just to get to my gear. The anchorage at Vendovie and, from Vendovie and Bellingham Bay, it's a constant flow into Marks Point with vessel traffic and tug escort. The law, the tug escort requirements that were implemented on September 1st probably increased our vessel traffic. I don't know the exact number, but I'm guessing by at least 25%. And that's been very hard on our treaty fishermen and their gear. So I think definitely a valid question.
Thank you. So we have a little bit more time, and with all of the panelists on the screen, I would like to kind of pose a question just based on what I have been hearing all of you talk about. Senator Williams kind of ended by sharing 5 specific suggestions for moving forward. And I'm not going to kind of go over all of them. Oops, there's my timer. Sorry, everybody. But I'm going to quickly touch on them. He suggested that the U.S. adopt what, or Washington adopt what BC just adopted in terms of implementing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons Act. He talked about kind of joint protocols or review of protocols, both with the Canadian and U.S. Coast Guards, as well as with Washington and BC provincial state governments. And you spoke to some studies as well. I'm wondering if Jamie and JD could maybe respond to those suggestions from Senator Williams, just kind of your thoughts from your vantage points, if you have any thoughts on those.
Well, I would say it's a great thing to bring up, Senator Williams, and I do believe that you know, a lot of things will be taken into consideration as we move forward, especially, you know, our work with Transboundary, and hopefully we can take a lot of things into account when we begin those transboundary conversations, including some of the things that you suggested. I don't know, JD, if you have anything more technical to speak to.
Well, I could say so. I don't know if it's technical
or not technical.
I just think that, you know, in terms of the modeling project, which is really where I, spend my time, I just think there's a really excellent opportunity here to spend time talking about all the Salish Sea as a whole, or at least the portion that we're looking at a minimum, but the cross-boundary aspects of the shared waters, and all the folks that are on the water, and all the folks that the water is part of their life, and how we can incorporate that stuff into the model as it relates to oil spill risk. Keeping in mind kind of our focus, which is spill risk, but also taking this as an opportunity to increase our shared understanding and build knowledge, and as appropriate, and where folks are able to, look at some of the stuff. I think like Tyson talked about, different ways to look at tribal fishing activity, and tribal just use of the waters, and how those things can be incorporated, and everyone can learn more about the waters and about our oil spill risk, right? So anyhow, I see that's one thing that I see in terms of the model that is opens a door to some of those conversations.
Right. Well, thank you, JD and Jamie, for responding to that question posed by me, and to Senator Williams for laying out some proposals and recommendations. We are at time with this panel. I want to thank all 3 of you, Senator Williams, JD, and Jamie, as well as Assistant Deputy Minister Wood, who is no longer with us on the call. Very thought-provoking, very insightful. Really appreciate the time and consideration you put into sharing your knowledge and wisdom and history with us today. There is a question in the Q&A about getting those 5 recommendations you had, Senator Williams, and I'm just going to kind of put it out there to you to see if we can get those from you to share out farther.
Okay, definitely. We will do that.
Great. Well, thank you again to our panelists.